we're pushing 200. I think I will get started. So good afternoon. My name is Marlene Puffer. I'm the chair of the Taxonomy and Transition Planning Council for the Business Future Pathways Initiative. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm very pleased to join you from Juichika, also known as Montreal. I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who were the first to live here, who have cared for these lands, and who continue to do so today. I'm located on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation. As we gather virtually from across Canada today with a lot of participants, I invite all of you to acknowledge the lands and waters where you are located, as well as the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who are their original stewards. I'll begin today's presentation with an overview of the methodology report draft that's out for public comment. It lays out the foundations of the taxonomy, and I'll be joined in this presentation by Jonathan Arnold, Head of Sustainable Finance at the Canadian Climate Institute. And following this presentation, there will be a Q&A session, and you can type your questions anytime using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So you can get started with questions now if you like. We will answer as many questions as we can after we present, and note, however, that we may direct some questions or comments to the formal comment process as we are officially open in our comment period. So you can go to the first slide, Jonathan, please. So what's the context? The report that we have put out is the fundamental bedrock or North Star of all the work to come. It underpins the key decisions about everything that we are doing in 6 sectors that we will tackle by the fall of 2027. And it's the paper that we will come back to determine the principles we need to abide by as we develop the detailed sector work to determine what counts as taxonomy aligned. This work has come from the work that preceded from the SFAC Council, and they had written a roadmap a few years ago. And we are also leaning on work that's been done across the globe. About 70 countries have taxonomies in place or underway. And Australia is one that has used the Canadian roadmap and has implemented their taxonomy. And so we're leaning heavily on Australia's work. We've done a thorough literature review, and we are working on a basis of looking at best practices across the globe. And it's important to understand a little bit about our governance process. The model is a really strong one, and it's what I really believe is going to make this taxonomy a success this time. I chair the council that has 17 members that include 4 from our financial sector advisory group, 4 from our technical advisory group, and then we have representation from our international advisory group, regulators, and some independent members as well. Overall, there's about 70 people involved in our advisory groups, and we're building more technical working groups to support the work sector by sector. Go to the next one, please. So our structure for today, we'll go next to the foundations of the taxonomy that I will introduce and Jonathan will elaborate on. We will define the 3 categories that we are proposing: green, transition, and abatement. We'll talk about the approach to this technical screening criteria as far as it has been developed so far in the methodology report. We'll help you understand why and how we prioritize certain sectors, and then we'll sum up with the timeline, and then we look forward to your questions. Move forward. Thanks, Jonathan. So just a reminder that this is a framework for this taxonomy that is voluntary, as most taxonomies across the globe are, that we're aiming for science-based classification, an approach that's very science-based and aligned with Canada's climate goals. And it really will be an effort at creating a standardized set of definitions and metrics that should help capital to move more efficiently and more freely within and across the Canadian landscape, and hopefully attract foreign capital into our sustainability efforts as well. We have a huge gap we need to fill of about $115 billion per year of investment in sustainability if we expect to reach net zero goals. And this is a very competitive landscape, so we are concentrating on having a taxonomy that, although is tailored to the Canadian context, hopefully will also remain very highly interoperable or comparable with our global peers, so that as foreign investors look at bringing capital into Canada, they understand our methodology and are comfortable with the standards that we have set. This should really help lower transaction cost and, importantly, really reduce the risk of greenwashing and build investor confidence in this approach. So very briefly, the taxonomy framework that we're proposing has three categories, which is somewhat new. So the green category is very common across taxonomies, so that should be quite straightforward. The transition sector is being used increasingly in other jurisdictions, particularly Australia and China, for example. And then we've proposed a new third abatement category, which is new for the Canadian context, given the importance of the oil and gas sector in the Canadian economy. It's an effort to address certain aspects of activities in that sector. And with that, I'll turn to Jonathan and he'll elaborate.
Yeah, thanks, Marlene. As noted, my name is Jonathan Arnold. I'm the head of sustainable finance at the Canadian Climate Institute. And before I jump into the more technical details of the report, I just want to acknowledge the enormous effort that went into producing this report on a very tight timeline. So all of the efforts within the Institute and all of our partners, it's been a big lift, and we look forward to the work to come. So I will walk through the core components of the draft out for public comment now, and walk through some of the different elements section by section of the report, starting with the foundations of the taxonomy. So taxonomies around the world, they focus on they can focus on different elements of sustainability, and the Canadian taxonomy that has in the recommended draft report, we recommend focusing first on climate mitigation in terms of lowering Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. And this is an objective that most taxonomies have started with around the world, and then the possibility of including other objectives such as climate adaptation or biodiversity in the future. We outlined 6 core principles that will ground the Canadian taxonomy. These range from, the first and foremost being credible. I'll speak to this in the next slide around the ambition of the Canadian taxonomy, but credibility is ultimately, paramount to this being a success, both in terms of credibly demonstrating pathways to reaching net zero, but also being setting that high bar from an international perspective. Second to that is usability. So we've seen in other taxonomies around the world that have been developed so far, usability has been a pinch point in some cases with taxonomies that are very robust in theory, but hard to implement in practice, either because of data limitations or criteria that just don't match the pathways that certain sectors actually have to reduce their emissions. Third principle around interoperability. So this is really about ensuring that the Canadian taxonomy be in alignment with the approaches taken in other taxonomies, so they essentially speak the same language, and that international investors can move across taxonomies without challenge. Fourth principle around being dynamic. So this is important in terms of ensuring that the Canadian taxonomy have criteria that increase in stringency over time, recognizing that as we get further along our path to net zero, the different criteria for different sectors will need to change to ensure that there's the constant improvement in emissions reductions, as well as the ability to update the taxonomy over time as technologies change. The fifth principle around regional specificity. This is quite unique to the Canadian context, and one that we don't really see in other jurisdictions, and I think largely because of our geography in Canada. But it's recognizing that the different technologies and pathways that are available in southern Canada or in urban centers may look different than in rural, remote, Indigenous, and northern communities. So we wanted to make sure that that was baked into the Canadian framework. And lastly, the sixth principle around being prioritized. So recognizing that we can't do all of the sectors all at once, and we have to phase this work. And I'll get into the details in a few slides about how we're actually doing that in practice, but breaking this up into bite-sized chunks. So a little bit more on the taxonomy ambition. So this is extremely important in terms of setting the bar or the goalposts for the Canadian taxonomy and any taxonomy. So the idea here is that you set a goalpost for what we want to achieve in the future, and then from that back out the pathways that align with that. And so in the report that is out for public comment, we have recommended that the taxonomy be anchored in the ambition of the Paris Agreement, which is keeping global temperature rise to 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But operationalizing this goal through Canada's legislated net zero by 2050 target. And the reason for that is that it is very challenging to identify whether a particular asset or a particular project is aligned with this fairly high level global commitment of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. Requires making unrealistic assumptions about trying to draw that line between what a project is doing and kind of that global target. So to address that challenge, we have recommended that we use Canada's net zero target as a way to operationalize that. So it gives us a very measurable and tangible target for a particular project or asset to say that, here's where they are today on their emissions, and they need to get to approaching zero emissions by mid-century. A little bit more on the taxonomy scope, and I'll get into this difference between Paris alignment versus net zero in a few slides in terms of how that actually plays out in the categorization framework. But essentially, the taxonomy is creating criteria for the green transition and abatement categories at the activity level or the project level. We're not talking here about requirements at the entity level or the corporate level. These types of entity level requirements are included in some other taxonomies as a mandatory component. But in the draft out for public comment, we have recommended that entity level requirements be strongly encouraged, but not mandatory. So these include things like credible net zero targets at a corporate level, or corporate transition plans, climate-related disclosure. All of those things are encouraged, but not a mandatory component for using the Canadian taxonomy. So another very important component of taxonomies generally, and the Canadian taxonomy in particular, are the frameworks around do no significant harm, and what I'll show on the next slide around minimum social safeguards. And these frameworks are essential to ensuring that just because a project aligns with the climate mitigation objective, it doesn't do undue harm to other environmental and social objectives. And so these are common components of taxonomy frameworks globally, and we have recommended that they be included in the Canadian framework as well. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the recommended scope of what do no significant harm framework would include in the Canadian context. So this would include objectives like climate change adaptation, pollution prevention, biodiversity protection, those types of things. And the framework that we've proposed in this report is applying a set of generic criteria that would apply to all activities under the taxonomy, as well as sector-specific criteria. And a really good example of that might be the mining sector, for example, where you would have a set of generic criteria that would apply to mining companies as well as any other type of company under the taxonomy, but then having mining-specific criteria given the potential for disturbance to other environmental objectives. So it includes both. And the other important part here to highlight is that the report has recommended a partial alignment approach in terms of how this would be implemented. And what that means is that it would be up to the taxonomy user or issuer to disclose what criteria they are meeting and what criteria they are not meeting. Some jurisdictions like the EU require that taxonomy users meet every single criteria in order to be aligned with the taxonomy. However, due to challenges with market adoption and just being able to use the taxonomy in practice, we've taken the approach, or recommended the approach, that Australia has taken around disclosure. A little bit more on the minimum social safeguards. So again, on the right-hand side, we have the intended scope of what would be included in the minimum social safeguards. So this includes four that are common across pretty well every jurisdiction. So labor standards, human rights, anti-corruption and bribery, and fair taxation. But we also include Indigenous rights as part of the scope here, and I'll provide a bit more detail on that on the next slide. But the idea is that these safeguards are designed to reduce the risk that projects advancing climate goals are at high risk of causing social harm. So we have recommended a similar approach to the do no significant harm, where you would have a set of generic criteria for the entities, and then a set of specific sector criteria that they would also need to meet, and similarly recommending the partial alignment approach, where it would be based on disclosure. So a little bit more about how Indigenous rights would be embedded within the proposed minimum social safeguards framework. So we've recommended an approach that's grounded in Canada's recognition of Indigenous rights and title, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and specifically Canada's UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. The framework recognizes Indigenous rights holders as distinct from other stakeholders, and as well, just kind of the basic fact that a lot of these projects that could be covered under the taxonomy or eligible for the taxonomy alignment will occur on or near Indigenous territories in Canada. So it is of high importance to getting this right. Also important to note that projects with actual or potential impacts on Indigenous lands and waters would still need to meet all of the requirements outside of the taxonomy framework that they currently need to meet in terms of impact assessments, reporting, duty to consult, those types of things. And we recognize as well that engagement with Indigenous experts and organizations is required to ensure that we get the minimum social safeguards criteria right, and that they're credible and meaningful and actionable in practice. So moving now into the third section of the report, which is where we have a framework for defining the green transition and abatement activities. So I'll walk through these in more detail in the slides to follow. So at this point, I'll just give a high-level overview and then a bit more detail. So we have the three categories, as Marlene mentioned, and at a very, very high level. So green activities are those that are zero or near zero emissions today. These are activities that will experience increasing global demand on the path to net zero, and are essentially solutions that we need more of to scale up. And so these are activities that can offer short-term emissions reductions as well as long-term emissions reductions. The transition framework, so this is, the transition category. This is a category that some other taxonomies have included, but not all taxonomies. So this is something where we can still learn from other jurisdictions. These are activities that are emissions intensive today, but still have stable or growing demand on the path to net zero. So these are activities like steel, cement, chemicals, agriculture. These are activities that can align to net zero by 2050, where we can see meaningful short-term emissions reductions as well as long-term emissions reductions. The third abatement category, so these are activities that are emissions intensive today, but unlike the other two categories, are activities that are highly likely to experience global demand decline on the path to net zero. And this is where the linking this to the Paris Agreement and kind of the implications of that is really important at a global level to understand what is aligned and what is not aligned. And so these are activities as a whole that likely cannot align with net zero by mid-century. They are activities that could offer material short-term emissions reductions, but where long-term emissions reductions are going to be really difficult to align with kind of the overarching ambition of the Canadian taxonomy. So I'll say a little bit more on that in a moment. I won't go through this framework in detail. This is the categorization framework on page 42 of the report, so I encourage you all to check it out. But essentially, this is the large decision tree for how we have put together the three different categories, and it starts on the left-hand side around this question of, does the activity face demand side risk, or does the activity face a highly likelihood of demand decline in Paris-aligned pathways? And from there, that's where we really split out the pathway for transition activities and the pathway for abatement activities. And then we have different criteria for each. I will also note that the third category, this abatement category, is proposed at this point. That's why you see the dotted line around 2B. And we're actively consulting on that in the public comment period. We would appreciate feedback on whether folks think that this category should exist, as well as the potential guardrails that we've included for that, which I'll speak to in a moment. So just a little bit more detail on each. I don't think I need to spend too much time on the green category, as I think this is probably intuitive for a lot of folks. So zero, near zero emissions, climate solutions would be in this bucket. I think what's worth highlighting is that it includes a set of enabling activities. So these are certain activities that essentially provide the materials or provide the services to enable green activities. And so we set quite a high bar for what those green enabling activities would include. In the report, we talk about a critical mineral mine as a good example of what this would mean in practice. And it's not enough for a critical mineral mine to just produce critical minerals to be eligible for that green label or that green category. That mine would need to be on a path that aligns with net zero. Would need to be a low emissions mine to be considered eligible for that. So we have a few examples in the report to help illustrate that. On the transition category side, so as I mentioned, so these are emissions intensive activities that have viable pathways to net zero by mid-century. What's interesting in this category, we have two pathways for alignment. We have what's called a whole of activity pathway and then a transition measures pathway. And the difference there, the whole of activity would refer to the entire operation of say a steel plant. So it's recognizing that the plant as a whole is on that aligned pathway to net zero, and therefore any of the activities associated with that plant or that facility would be aligned with the transition category. There will be other cases where the facility is unable to meet that high bar for decarbonizing, and in that case there still may be meaningful ways or areas where the facility or plant can make substantial emissions reductions through specific upgrades or specific technologies. So this transition measures pathway offers a way of helping to ring fence the investments to reduce emissions while still making the distinction that the facility as a whole is not quite there. So eligibility for this category would be time bound. I'll come back to that in a few slides in terms of what that means in practice. Requires guardrails to avoid locking in emissions, recognizing that building a new facility or building a new plant has implications in the long term in terms of making it harder or more expensive to reduce emissions in the future. And then lastly, just to clarify that this transition category would not include oil and gas activities. And that segues to the third abatement category. So this, as I mentioned, is a novel category based on the Canadian context. No other taxonomies in the world have tried to do this. So this refers to ring-fenced short-term investments that can substantially make emissions reductions in activities like upstream oil and gas. So these would be this framework recognizes that the activity as a whole may not be aligned, but there may be specific investments that are worth doing to reduce emissions in the short term. So it's trying to make that distinction between decarbonizing activity and encouraging the activity itself. And so that really is the crux of this abatement category, and ensuring that we get those short-term emissions reductions without locking in emissions in the long term. In the report, we propose an initial or preliminary set of guardrails that could be included to ensure the credibility of this abatement category. So this would be limiting assets, or limiting the category to existing assets. So no new projects would be included under that sort of guardrail. Of course, including requirements around significant Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions reductions, so the emissions happening within the facility itself and the electricity or the energy that it uses, as well as the potential for Scope 3 or downstream and upstream emissions reductions, as well as potential guardrails around asset decommissioning and around guardrails around the asset lifespan itself. So there's still lots to consider there. As I say, we're really looking for public comment on all of this, but this category in particular, in terms of what people think of the third category generally, as well as the guardrails that have been proposed. So moving on to section 4 of the report, which gets into the technical screening criteria. So just to ensure everyone is aware, so the idea is to produce this initial framework and have this come out sometime in the fall. Marlene will talk to the timelines in a moment. But then the hard work really starts of developing technical screening criteria at a sector level for determining whether specific activities meet that green transition abatement threshold or category. And so to do that, we need a menu of different ways or approaches to making sure that we have technical screening criteria that are credible and usable. So in this report, we've laid out what that menu looks like, and at a high level, we recognize that these technical screening criteria in many cases are going to need to be forward-looking in that they were going to need to ratchet up over time, particularly for the transition and abatement categories, to ensure that we continue to see that level of ambition increase to reach the goal of net zero by mid-century. Recognizing that we want to have quantitative technical screening criteria where possible. This may not always be the case. In some sectors, such as agriculture, that will be challenging, no doubt. But quantitative criteria are going to be easier for the market to implement and adopt. We have technical screening criteria that will need to likely include sunset or sunrise dates, recognizing that technologies that are viable today may not be aligned with a net zero path in 5 or 10 years, and so we need to consider that, while also recognizing that we need to give the market some certainty as to where certain technologies or approaches fall in the framework. Recognizing that the criteria will likely need to consider upstream and downstream emissions in some cases where they're really material, as well as revising these technical screening criteria on a periodic basis, and that's certainly where we want to do that very intentionally, recognizing that the more we change these technical screening criteria, the harder it is for the markets to know with any degree of certainty where these categories stand. So there's an element of this where we need to update it regularly for technology and as the different pathways change, but also recognizing that we need to be very intentional about that and do it in periodic and regular intervals. And then last, just being informed by robust methods, and that underpins all of the technical screening criteria, I believe. Okay, so the last section of the report is about sector prioritization. So this provides more on the rationale of the 6 sectors that we've identified for prioritizing this year and next year. And so for the work that will begin essentially over the summer and into the fall will be for electricity, buildings, and transportation. And the idea is to have initial guidance or preliminary guidance for those three sectors out for consultation before the end of the calendar year, and then finalizing those early in 2027. And then shifting gears to the next tranche of sectors, mining, manufacturing, agriculture, and forestry in 2027. With that, I will pass it back to you, Marlene, to talk a little bit more about taxonomy timelines.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. That was great. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, the public comment period is open and goes through August 13th. This is a very narrow window. We recognize that, and it is in the middle of summer. It is not ideal. However, our mandate came from the government, and although we are an independent entity here that is running this and approving this taxonomy work, we do have a deadline, and that deadline requires us to deliver 6 sectors by fall of next year. And when we backed that up to try and figure out the best timeline, this was where we landed, and we got this window as wide as we could under those circumstances. The final methodology report will incorporate feedback from the comments that we anticipate receiving, and we anticipate turning that back in the fall of 2026 this year. And at the same time, we're working on constituting the sector the sector technical working groups and having that work proceed alongside the comment period and the revisions to this paper. It is also the case that part of our mandate is to create a permanent home for this work. So this isn't just going to be a one and done, and then it doesn't continue on beyond fall 2027 once the 6 sectors are done. This will be a living, breathing taxonomy, and so everything will be revisited over time, and that's part of our job of standing up the permanent home, is to consider that part of the process. So you have the comment portal, so please direct your comments there, and please note that we have a lot of questions posed and embedded in the methodology publication. But you do not have to answer all of those. If you have comments to make about one of those questions, that's enough. Please do submit those, or please feel free to comment in other ways that are not necessarily aligned with the exact questions that we have identified. And if you need any help or have any further clarifying questions that we haven't addressed today or that don't get addressed in the FAQ document that we will produce following this and the French language webinar, you can reach out to Sonia Lee at the Secretariat at businessfuturepathways.ca. So just to sum up in terms of the timeline, it's been really remarkable. As Jonathan said, huge thank you to the team at Business Future Pathways, at the Secretariat, and at the Canadian Climate Institute, and all of the working groups and the Council. We've gotten this report out on time and look forward to the public comment period. I already mentioned that the final methodology report will come out in the fall, and then there will be another consultation period for the first 3 sectors, also in late fall. And then that guidance for those first 3 sectors will come out in the winter. And same thing, we will have a public comment period for the second set of 3 sectors in the spring, and then produce the final guidance in the fall of 2027. And by then we will also have determined the permanent home and the structure going forward for guiding all of this work. So I think that's it. There's the information again, and perhaps they can post those in the chat as well so that you have those handy. And I'm now going to turn it to Sonia Lee, who is the heads up the Secretariat, to moderate our Q&A.
Great, thanks, Marlene. So, hi everyone. We receive a lot of questions, and we're going to do our best to answer most of them, but we appreciate that we may not have time. So just know that we're working on an FAQ to publish on the website. So we'll start with the more overall clarification questions, and then we've received a few questions about the ambition of the taxonomy. and kind of like the political and climate policy context that we're in. And given the change that the Prime Minister Carney may send signal in terms of like the Paris Agreement. So what does anchor to 2 degrees mean? Are we aligning or not aligning with the Paris Agreement?
So the the report out for public comment, I think, is quite clear on that in terms of ensuring that this taxonomy framework is grounded in the ambition of the Paris Agreement, and then very clear on what that means in terms of aligning with Canada's legislated net zero target. And that's exactly why we chose to operationalize this through the net zero target. This is something that actually very few taxonomies have done, or at least kind of shown transparently, like how this will be operationalized in practice, because it's very vague otherwise in terms of how you ensure a steel plant or a chemicals plant is aligned with a 2 degree pathway. You have to make very complex assumptions about a global carbon budget, and then kind of work your way down from a global level to a country level to a provincial level to a sector level and then to an asset level. So it's a lot simpler to have the goalpost of net zero by 2050 and work toward that. With reference to kind of the current context, this is a tool that is being built for the long term. Obviously, the current context is what it is, but hasn't really affected the design of this. As I mentioned, the goal of a taxonomy, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere, is that you set your goalpost, which is in this case Paris alignment, net zero, and then back out from that what technologies and pathways are aligned with that. And so the current context doesn't really change that. If anything, I mean, a lot of technologies that were not commercially viable a few years ago are now. So it I think actually works in the favor of making pathways a little bit easier to achieve than not. Maybe that's all I'll say on that for now. Marlene, I don't know if you have any other additional thoughts.
Nope, that was
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
Maybe not on this, but a follow-up question that I've read a lot in the Q&A box is, Marlene, could you expand your perspective in terms of the adoption, given the current political and geopolitical context? Why do you think this time the taxonomy will work?
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot to unpack there, so bear with me. I'll address a few things. First of all, yes, we've made an effort in Canada to put this taxonomy in place over quite a number of years now, and that effort has been largely driven by the financial sector. So that demand for this taxonomy, it still remains, and the financial sector remains highly committed to ensuring that we can create this set of standardized guidelines. Now, yes, there's geopolitics that have, particularly south of the border, meant that the conversation around alignment with net zero and climate mitigation has shifted, but it hasn't really shifted among investors, especially asset owners with long investment horizons. So I'm engaged regularly with the largest pension plans and endowments across the globe, and even those in the US are still deeply committed to managing their exposure to climate risk. It's an important investment risk. So the conversation's changed, the language has changed, some of it has gone a little bit underground, so to speak, but the activity is still front and center. And so I think that with that demand, the desire to have a standardized set of detailed guidelines is very clear. The rest of the world has been creating taxonomies, and capital has flowed. The market for green and similar bonds is about $1 trillion now, and capital is flowing aligned with taxonomies globally. So we need to compete for that capital to meet our own climate targets. And finally, I'll just come back to the governance model that we have in place this go round. So still driven by the financial sector, because this is about capital flow and supporting that with clarity. But we have engaged this time as an independent council, independent of government. So the independence from other industrial policy is important here. We're just trying to set a labeling system, and we're trying to maintain that narrow focus to just be clear that that's what we're doing. So that independence is important and will be helpful. And we've added as well a very impressive group of people on the technical advisory group. If you have a minute, take a look at the Business Future Pathways website for the list of members. We have climate scientists, policymakers, and economists, and it's really quite remarkable to enhance, Jonathan and team at CCI. And so we've really engaged along the way with experts who should help with the usability and comparability of this taxonomy. So I think we've got the model right, and the market is still ripe to get this done.
Thanks, Marlene. Following up with another question. So we receive a lot of question about the proposed abatement category and the oil and gas sector. So to kickstart this conversation, to both of you, I think, what is the value of the transition and abatement categories and who benefit from them? Is there a risk to introduce this category in the taxonomy?
Yeah, thanks, Leila. That's a great question. So this is new. This is innovative, and this is what we really are hoping that we'll receive a lot of comment on. Early feedback has suggested that people are quite receptive to this category. We've proposed it after much deliberation, and there's been a lot of very robust debate in our advisory groups around this. And one of the reasons to propose it is that Canada's oil and gas sector is only about 7% of GDP, but it's about 30% of emissions. So it's very difficult to have a taxonomy that's going to help get us to net zero that ignores that sector. So it's partially an effort to bring shine a light on some activities in that sector that do have short-term positive impact on reducing emissions. We do have more work to do on this category, and that's where the comment period is important for us as well. So there's a lot more to do to shape that. But it also has a potential role of helping to really clarify what does belong in the transition category. Because instead of just saying something is going to be transition or not, we're making an effort to have more clarity about some of those activities that some might argue should go into transition, but are more clearly in a category where demand is declining rather than increasing, and we want to have a clear line around that, in a sense, to protect the transition category itself. Jonathan, feel free to add.
Yeah, I mean, I would flip that question around and think about the risk of not including it. And I think back to the Sustainable Finance Action Council framework that we were helping develop a few years ago, and it was included within the transition category. And for all of the reasons that Marlene just mentioned, I think separating that out is really helpful. But I think there's a reality, certainly in Canada, that financial institutions have their own internal taxonomies, and that's partly the problem that we're trying to solve in creating a stronger standard across the financial ecosystem. If we don't include it, they will continue to think about that within their own internal frameworks, and then you're left with the same issue that we currently have around confusion over what is aligned and what is not aligned. And so in our view, we have to tackle it. And the best way to do that is to provide clear, credible guidance and show what robust guardrails would look like, or what they would need to look like to be taxonomy aligned.
Yeah. So please offer your comments on this. This is one of the key things we're interested in feedback on.
Thank you both. So as another question, so we've received a few questions. So Jonathan, can you expand a bit more and clarify how do you expect the DNSH, pardon me, and MSS criteria to apply? Or is it going to be irrespective of the activity classification? How does it actually going to work in practice?
Yeah, so there we're going to really take the lead of other jurisdictions, particularly Australia, because they're the latest to develop a taxonomy, I think, and have integrated a lot of the learnings internationally in terms of the approach that they've taken. So if you look at their approach, they have a set of generic criteria that apply to all activities, and in some cases that might just be, does a project meet all of the regulatory and legal requirements within that particular jurisdiction, whether it's a province or a territory at the federal level. And then specific requirements at the activity level. And those would be worked out through this next phase in the technical working groups. So I mentioned mining as an example. So you might have general requirements that any projects, including mining, would need to meet, and then specific criteria that would be just applicable to the mining sector based on the specific impacts that activity can have on these other important sustainability objectives.
Thanks, Jonathan. And maybe kind of like building on the DNSH question. So for actual and potential impact on Indigenous lands, water, and rights, how does it gonna be determined? Is it gonna be included in DNSH? Pardon me, it's very hard for me to say. And how do we respect Indigenous rights? I don't know, Marlene, if you want to tackle this first and explain what we're doing with that.
Yeah, obviously, the Canadian context is different from really any other country's context. Our Indigenous communities and First Nations and Indigenous peoples have rights here that are not the case in other countries. And so we're taking this very seriously. And this is, again, part of the comment period is we're really making a lot of effort to connect with Indigenous rights holders, knowledge holders, and so on, and as best we can with First Nations directly to get their input at this early stage. And we have to do that as best we can and continuously through this process. Australia and New Zealand have put some efforts into this as well, importantly. But the context is different in those two countries. So we're building to some extent on what has been done there. And Jonathan can say a few things about the disclosure oriented approach to that. But there's lots more to do on this. And this is something that we will continue to work on as we build the sector-based guidelines. And we are making every effort to include Indigenous representation on our decision-making body. We do have an important Indigenous leader on the council. We have one on the Financial Sector Advisory Group. We continue to make effort to include representation in our Technical Advisory Group. And we will absolutely have Indigenous representation in our technical working groups at the sector level. And as we speak, I'm having a lot of one-on-one engagements, and we have webinars that are specifically aimed at our Indigenous engagement efforts. And so, Jonathan, maybe you can get a little more technical about that.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add. I mean, just aside from reiterating the fact that, I think Canada's in a fairly unique position, and I think there's an opportunity here to demonstrate some leadership internationally in terms of how to do this. I think the challenge from a technical perspective is how to create criteria that are well articulated and actionable by the market. So just to give an example, the Australian taxonomy has a commitment around the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but it's not super clear in terms of how that's operationalized at a project level. And so that is something that we're actively looking for comment on in this public comment period, to help us get our arms around some of those challenges, and land criteria that are ambitious, credible, but as well as actionable on the ground.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'll follow up a question for you when it comes to the categories and the scope emission. So could you elaborate on the intention behind using scope 1 emission primarily for the green category and transition categories, but considering scope 2 and 3 categories for the abatement category?
Sure, yeah, and maybe just for everyone's benefit, just so everyone's aware. So scope 1 emissions are the emissions happening within the fence of a project. Scope 2 emissions are those that are associated with the energy consumed, so the electricity used within a facility. And then scope 3 would be the emissions upstream and downstream of a facility. So the framework that we've proposed is largely based on setting technical screening criteria around scope 1 emissions. And that is for a few reasons, one of which is that the scope 1 emissions are those that are within the direct control of a facility, and so they have direct agency over that to align themselves with the taxonomy. So that's a big part of it. The other part is that because we want to design this taxonomy to touch all sectors, we're eventually going to hopefully cover all of the other aspects of the value chain by covering, say, if we're thinking about electricity and we're only talking about the generation of a facility and not maybe how the solar panels or wind turbines are made, that would be covered in the manufacturing sector. So we're hoping to cover other elements of the value chain through the taxonomy more broadly. On scope 3, that is directly embedded in the categorization framework. So that first question around, is global demand for this activity expected to grow or shrink in Paris-aligned pathways, that is explicitly talking about downstream scope 3 emissions associated with fossil fuel combustion, essentially. And that is why demand declines in those ambitious climate scenarios. So it is baked into the framework, but in terms of the technical screening criteria, that's where we focus primarily on scope 1.
Thanks, Jonathan. And from also with a question on categories, if we follow up from a user standpoint, Marlene, I have a question for you. So do you think the activity-based categories will actually complicate evaluating investor portfolio alignment and fund or product development?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think actually, this taxonomy should, as a standardized set of guidelines, be helpful. At the activity level, this is an effort to be refined in the approach here so that we can be very specific. So I think that this should actually be helpful and overall a simplification in being able to standardize this analysis. There are certainly instances where through the feedback process, please do offer your comments around specific examples or areas where you think this may turn into something problematic, and we will absolutely take that in under consideration.
Thanks, Marlene. Jonathan, going back to the abatement category, kind of like bucket of questions. So are there other sectors that would be included in a potential abatement category, or it would only be oil and gas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that will change over time, right? Like as we get closer to 2050, activities that are currently in that transition bucket may need to be reassessed based on viable pathways to net zero. So that's an open question, one that we've thought a lot about, but obviously don't have a lot of answers for at this point. The other type of activity that we considered for including there is the manufacture of internal combustion engines or engine vehicles, but really there's already a low carbon substitute for those, so that's why we didn't include those as a potential activity for the abatement category. So short answer is I think that will change over time, and that's why we've designed it as such so that it's flexible and can change over time.
Great.
But the principles should stand the test of time fairly well.
Yeah. Going back to the sixth principle that like Jonathan and Marlene shared previously. So now a question about the relationship with government, Marlene. So how are you interacting with any government, whether it's NRCan, provincial government, given the importance of the taxonomy and the kind of like $115 billion that we need in investment?
Thank you. So as I said earlier, we are an independent body, and that's very important to remember. We do have the mandate that was given to us by the Department of Finance, and Minister Ryan Turnbull has the mandate from the Prime Minister's office to oversee this. So we're accountable in our work to the Department of Finance and to Minister Turnbull, only to the extent that we deliver against the mandated job. So delivering a taxonomy that abides by the principles that we have outlined already today. So that's it. There's no direct influence or participation of the government in our work. As far as other interaction goes, there's awareness in government that this work is underway, of course, but we are very much separate from any other policy making, and our goal is clear. We want to facilitate the movement of capital into sustainable investing activities.
Thanks, Marlene. So in terms of the priority sector, as a next question, so you probably gather in the audience that we have a very ambitious timeline to follow, but someone asked, as part of being dynamic, the taxonomy, do you anticipate any other additional priority sectors in the future?
The answer is yes. We've tackled these to be impactful ones and ones that also have taxonomies elsewhere in the world for the most part, so that we can leverage the work that's been done elsewhere to get really good, strong traction on the sectors that we have prioritized. But as I mentioned, our job is to come up with a permanent home for this work. And by extension, the next round will prioritize some additional sectors. If the oil and gas sector is one, so we're tackling it somewhat indirectly with the definition of the abatement category, but we will get to that sector after these ones.
Great. Thank you. Another question on usability. So there's much thought being given to the industrial investment context and how this taxonomy can map or be useful in that context, like in terms of like directing funding to different projects. So I just realized, and then I'm reading the question, I apologize, and then it's not very clear.
Yeah. So
let me reframe it. Okay, my apologies. So is there thought being given to the industrial investment context and how the taxonomy can map or be useful in that context?
Well, I think that's if I'm understanding the question, it's really what we're trying to do. And so remembering that, the industrial investment context is exactly what we're trying to facilitate. And through our technical working groups, we'll be engaging with industry and getting their input to ensure that the taxonomy meets their needs. I'm not quite sure I understand what they're after on the question. Jonathan, do you want to add some comments?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add. Yeah, I mean, aside from just that we're trying to ensure that the taxonomy is designed so that it can meet the moment to drive more investment towards projects that will help Canada decarbonize.
And maybe last question, we have like 1 minute left. So as part of Canada long-term net zero strategy and export ambition, that's a tricky question. Where would nuclear be positioned within this taxonomy?
That's a good question, and it's premature for us to answer that question at this time. So that's work that needs to be done with the technical working groups in the context of the do no significant harm aspect of the work. And that's exactly what we'll be pursuing going forward, and we absolutely welcome input on that.
Great. Thank you, both of you, for taking the time to answer the question. As I mentioned, I know and I appreciate there's a lot of question and interest in the methodology report. We're working internally to publish a FAQ on the website, and we have been tracking all the question in the Q&A function. Marlene, I'll pass it on to you for a last word.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jonathan and Sonia Lee, for facilitating this and answering questions so effectively. As you can see, there's a lot of interest. We have a lot of participants in today's call, and please do spread the word out there in industry, among professional associations, any interested parties, especially Indigenous experts and First Nations. And please do encourage others to participate in offering their insights into this work. We will take all of that input very seriously, and we have a methodology for reviewing all of the input. And as I say, we'll circulate a new version of this in the fall to reflect that feedback. So thank you very much for time, effort, energy today, and look forward to hearing more from you.